All right. Well, this is Linda. Good morning. I'm with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I will confess that I've never been great with technology skills, and this will certainly be a test in terms of juggling everything. So, just a little introduction in terms of the title. What we were called upon, WSCDF, to do was something that was related to model forms, policies, and procedures related to housing and relocation assistance. Well, I don't know about you all, but I hear the words policies, forms, and procedures and think, oh my gosh, how possibly boring, more boring could that get? And I decided that even though it's really important content that could be attractive to people, I wanted to make it a little bit more exciting and a little bit more interesting. So we've put a map up here of forging a path to flexibility and using a travel theme. Since we can't really travel right now, it's nice to remember that there are so many people out in this big wide world and how impacted we all are by this COVID-19 problem. And I just hope everybody who is with us is staying safe and healthy and appropriately distanced. I'm here in my home office, and I've been so entertained by looking at all of the different places we're Zooming and webinaring and having chats in people's living rooms and kitchens and home offices, and the variety of kids and pets and things that pop up in our different chats. And there's a certain personal touch, even though we are at a distance. It feels a little more personal as far as our webinars. So, getting back to the content and our itinerary, otherwise known as an agenda, but we'll talk about our travel goals, how we are going to build this travel guide, the guide content, making sure we talk about survivors' travel needs with us along this journey, documenting the trip, and I do hope that there will be time for questions afterwards in one form or another. So the first thing is, why are we doing this webinar? One of the things in terms of our contract with our VOCA DSH monitors, and I see we've got them with us this morning, is to kind of connect in many ways VOCA and DV Housing First. The greatest expansion lately in VOCA money has included housing relocation on top of transitional housing. And both of those pots of money and those activities have huge implications for survivors who are looking for housing, desperately needing support. And when you combine those two items, the housing relocation money and support with emergency flexible assistance, boom, you've basically got a DV Housing First approach. And I know many of you share the philosophy that survivors have a right to housing just like anybody else, as they direct and as they request. And it's great that we can be supportive for that. So our DSHS folks are saying, since this is new to the state, please WSCDF do some trainings, do some webinars related to this. So this is the third in a series of 3 webinars. It's called Housing Advocacy and Emergency Flexible Financial Assistance. And it was preceded by one that was housing relocation. And that one occurred back in October 23rd. We have the slides for it that I can send you if you wanted access to that. We did one February 5th on emergency financial assistance and how to use it. And that's the one that is really packed full with details about what's eligible, what isn't eligible, what you can and can't spend money on. And that was February 5th. That one is recorded. And also I have slides that I could send your way if you missed that. So why are we going on this trip? What are our travel goals? And of course, everybody on this webinar either has some sort of financial assistance that they can disperse, whether it's through housing relocation in VOCA, emergency financial assistance. This might be also for many of you through other sources, totally flexible Gates money that has come through WESCADIV. It might be your local public dollars, Best Starts for Kids, state money, diversion money. So there are many, many pots out there right now. And everybody really knows that they can benefit from it, that survivors can make a big difference or in their lives to have access to this. So one of the things that everybody is talking about is, well, we want it, but what do we do with it? How do we structure it? What is our plan? Questions include, how can we be survivor driven when you've got so many different pots of money and so many different funders and contingencies? Somewhere in that, the survivors can often get lost, and it becomes more driven by the half a dozen or so of funder needs rather than what it is a survivor really needs. How flexible can we really be? That's also a question that we need to think about, ask ourselves, and have the plan and the roadmap for that. And how can we create a map for advocates to use when navigating all of these interactions? So we'll start out with building the travel guide and the process. And the quote up in the right-hand corner is from an advocate a few years ago as we were doing our flexible financial assistance and the Gates demonstration and research project, which just ended in 2019. We did focus groups with advocates and survivors. And this comment from an advocate, there were so many changes that led to this process. The way we did our work was just completely different. And it was really hard at first. And what advocates consistently told us pretty much across all 8 programs was that during the planning process for how to put this money together and how to structure it, use it, make it available, advocates weren't necessarily included in the conversation. And it did not have a good start for some agencies because of that, and we so understand that. So this is just the encouragement. Start with advocates and what they're hearing from survivors. At those tables, the survivors will be there through their requests that advocates are hearing and what advocates know about the people they serve. And they are such an important part of the planning process in terms of how you put money out there and how you think about spending it. Conversations need to happen early. This isn't a let's just get it all into place once we get this money. It's a matter of, this is what we're thinking about doing. And we know that certainly with your DSHS VOCA money, they want a plan. And they want an even more detailed plan once you do get the money. But starting out early on with everybody on staff and not just waiting until, oh my gosh, I need to start spending this, is a good way to get started. It needs to be rooted in survivor-driven, trauma-informed advocacy. As I already mentioned, it is so easy when you have the multiple needs of funders based on the funding sources, taxpayer dollars, contracts, all of these complex things, to forget to be survivor driven, to forget the survivors at the center of this, and to forget how important it is to be trauma informed as you're working with people. Of course, finance and reporting staff have to be in on these conversations right from the very beginning, and that could provide some very interesting moments along the way. Sometimes finance and program staff have little misses in terms of the conversation that's happening, which is a good thing. I think the finance staff, certainly in my experience, has always been the people who grounded me when I just wanted to have great wishes and conquer the world and do everything for everybody. And it was always great to hear that that might not be possible. So it's a wonderful balance. So be ready for some great conversations. So speaking of conversations, it is really important to think about those funding source requirements, the agency financial structure, the mechanism to track money that's available, and how to communicate with advocates. So these are the tips for agency management and for the finance folks, to really be in tune with what are the requirements, how is the agency set up. You might not be set up to be dispersing flexible financial assistance or doing the housing relocation rental assistance. Whatever that might be, there might be some special things you need to do within your own bookkeeping, record keeping that you know will satisfy your own auditor as well as your contract monitors. Mechanism to track money. It's important to have that available. And at this point, there's just a quick little commercial for a financial assistance tracker that we have on our webpage. And at the very end of the webinar, I'll guide you to our toolkit with a little bit of luck. So it's good to have a mechanism to track the money. Well, it's vital, but in a way that it can be shared with advocates, readily seen, readily available, so you know how much money you have, which funding sources, so that when you look at your procedures, you can figure out what you can do for which people. For the advocates, it's how do they make money available? How do they connect with survivors to inform them or let them know that there are possibilities? How are their financial requests reviewed and approved? That is so critical along the way, because I've heard nationally in many places, and including here in Washington State, that advocates didn't necessarily know what the process was, or it might have been a mystery. The programs that have been, in my opinion, the most successful are the ones that are very, very transparent, so that advocates know what happens to the requests they make. Or maybe they are empowered enough that they can basically take a pot of money on their own, and some organizations do this, and know that they are trusted to distribute it. Perhaps there's a cap in terms of anything over a certain amount, like $300 needs to be approved by somebody else, maybe management, and ultimately the check signer has to take a look at what's happening. And then how is the money provided? And this is something I'm going to pick up as we go, a theme in terms of undocumented survivors who are coming to your services, and how do they receive this assistance? How does the money get to them? How are they able to utilize that? Sometimes our own auditing procedures can really trip us up there. Our funding sources are pretty good. I don't know of any of our direct funding sources, other than if we're looking at public housing authorities. Our funding sources through OVW, through OVC, through FIPSA, certainly our local state, and HUD Continuum of Care, all are very flexible and open for undocumented survivors. So the procedures, what needs to be in the travel guide? So we need procedures for advocates. Advocates need to have a really clear roadmap for determining eligibility in accordance with funding sources, and procedures for submitting requests. So when we think about the funding sources, as I mentioned, some of you might only have the DSHS VOCA at your fingertips. Others might have a wide variety of places where money is available, both for housing relocation and other flexible financial assistance. So trying to sort that through in a way that advocates know what's available and to whom and what the criteria might be. So there is somebody with some background noise that might need to mute themselves. I thought everybody was muted, but thank you. So anyway, I was submitting requests. Advocates need to understand how to do that and to whom that goes. And we'll talk about the forms to do it with a little bit later. For the accounting staff, they need to understand the procedures for disbursements and for communicating with vendors. This can be pretty complicated at times when most of our structure is to write out checks or give money to third-party vendors such as landlords. And we need to be very careful about how we do that as far as confidentiality. What are we talking to vendors about? And we will get deeper into this conversation later, but accounting staff need to know that. Advocate staff usually do, but accounting staff need to be just in tune with that as much as anybody. For management staff, you need procedures for approving financial disbursements and for communicating fund availability to advocates. Some of the trip ups that have happened is when everybody had access at once to money, when it was the completely flexible financial assistance, it often ended up that nobody knew really how much money there was available. So certainly having that consistent guidance of how that's funneled, who tracks it, who says this is how much you have, these are the pots of money it's available from, and the communication, all really important procedures. And these procedures are going to vary agency by agency. It is going to depend upon your culture as an agency, how large you are. It will depend upon the funding sources that come through. It will also depend upon who you're serving. You know, what does your community look like? And are you thinking about and clearly serving undocumented survivors? So all of these procedures need to be clear and very flexible because they'll change. One funding source that you might have today might not be there next year. So having the flexibility by funding source so that you're not putting out hard and fast procedures that need to be really flexible. And finally, it's really important to have a procedure or just the note to communicate with survivors, an understanding of the process and next steps, so that there isn't this question about, well, am I getting help? Is money coming? Is there a check going to the landlord? What's happening? Is somebody paying the car repair shop for assistance? So being really clear about that makes a huge difference. I think we can all identify with that as we're thinking about our stimulus checks coming from the government and wondering where they might end up and how that's happening, and not always having clear communication about that. One of my favorite little terms relates to the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. And this is especially what I think about in terms of policies and oftentimes rules, is we get so bound up with what that hard and fast policy or rule is that we forget about the spirit, the reason why it was put into place, and the potential for it to be flexible. It's just policies are a lot harder to change than procedures, and being mindful about what you land on that has to be that hard and fast policy that is not quite as flexible as tweaking your procedures a little bit. It's important to be sure that you can be flexible and nimble in responding to survivor needs. The quote on the side is another one that came out of our focus groups. This one, a focus group with survivors. And this was always so gratifying when we heard from survivors how much they appreciated their advocates. So many of them said that the money, the rental assistance, whatever it might be, was so important, but it was the advocates that made all the difference in the world and was the most important to all. So this is that quote: "The advocates are very open to the individual's circumstances. The advocates make all the difference." So kudos to all of you who are advocates and do absolutely outstanding work. Maybe as I leave this, and we'll talk a little bit more, but when your policies are hard and fast, when you've got certain policies, you as the agency, and not even necessarily as the funding source, might have difficulties in terms of providing flexible financial assistance for undocumented survivors. When we talk about our audit requirements, and I know this is shared by our VOCA money, but the idea that we can't give cash or write out a check, and sometimes not even gift cards directly to survivors, can really limit someone's ability to negotiate, to be able to provide for themselves. And it's a piece of autonomy, as well as that confidentiality about circumstances and confidentiality about their situation, needing support from a domestic violence agency. I know that many auditors will certainly say, if you do that, you need to have certain documentation pieces in place. When Wiskative did our focus groups for survivors, and we provided them with cash, I started out with gift cards and then heard a lot of feedback that gift cards were limiting. They weren't quite as flexible. And for so many people, it worked to make it as flexible as possible. So we had the arrangement with our auditor that as long as cash assistance was initialed, that there was some sort of a document in terms of how much cash assistance or a check was received, and initialed by the individual, that was adequate. Again, VOCA doesn't allow for cash assistance or direct payments to survivors, but there are other sources that are very good about that. And that becomes your internal policy of, so can you do something like this? And keep in mind all of the reasons why you might want to and the limiting factors. So talking to survivors about their travel needs, the conversation. One of my challenges when we get into nuts and bolts about policies and forms and procedures is too many times survivors are lost in all of that. We get too wrapped up in our checklists and check boxes, wanting to make sure that we do everything right, cross the T's, dot the I's, that we lose the importance of that conversation. So it's have that conversation. Maybe it's on the hotline. We have several agencies that have been able to provide flexible financial assistance as a result of a hotline call. And they have some fascinating but yet very easy procedures to do that. And they consider that hotline conversation and what the survivor has expressed, and they fill out a very simple form related to that and take it through their very abbreviated internal processes and are able to get money either to a survivor quickly or to a vendor. It's important to think about the services that could or might go with that, but many organizations in the state And across the country, Washington, D.C. in particular, they used flexible financial assistance as a way to open the conversation. And the primary start was, what do you need? And how can we do that quickly for you? And please let us know what else we are able to do. One executive director in particular out on the peninsula frequently talks about, first thing she does is ask people what they need. And then after that's satisfied, that most urgent thing, being able to dig into, so now what can we do? So thinking about all of the emergency sorts of assistance that someone might need in the height of fleeing, in the height of trying to be safe, this could be really useful. And keep in mind that it could be a wide open door. Our mobile advocacy face-to-face, going with and where people are. Of course, most of us probably aren't doing that at all these days, but we did, many of us did, and I hope that we will return to that. Face-to-face conversations are so important, in person and certainly remote advocacy now. And I'm not going to get into all the details how to do that because my technology skills are not there for it, for one thing. And NNEDV does an amazing job in their world of tech safety, and they have some great tips under their COVID-19 responses for how you can do advocacy remotely and do it safely and with a high level of confidentiality. So with these conversations, be sure to listen. Build that relationship. Put that form to one side with all of its check boxes and listen. And watch yourself for implicit bias. We all have it. That is the way we're wired. We are born and raised with that sense of, these are my tribe. These are the people that I connect with, that raised me, that I'm familiar with. And we all have to stop at some point and say, we need to get past that. We need to really address that and really listen to somebody with a trauma-informed lens and focusing on the relationship and really concentrating on that. It's so important. It makes a difference. Ask them for what they need and offer possibilities if you hear that what might be helpful isn't being named. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, but just, we again get so caught up with making sure that this domestic violence survivor, and by now we've confirmed we're talking to somebody who is fleeing domestic violence, recovering from sexual violence, that they are victims of crime. And we've confirmed that, and now it's thinking more of, so what do you need to help you be safe? What do you need to help you heal and be in a better place? What are your needs? Because sometimes people don't always know how to articulate a really clear, this is what I want and need, or it might not be logical or make sense. But being able to ask them what they need, listen to the conversation, and then offer maybe some possibilities. The little piece on the left, I remember this survivor, and I remember tearing up when I heard them say this. I don't like asking for help. I did not want to ask for help because every time I ask for help, people judge you or look down on you. And I think most of us are like that. It's hard to ask for help in so many ways. It really depends on the level of hurt and pain and shame and the self-questioning and doubt of, why couldn't we do this on our own, that we're bad people. So being able to think about that. I mentioned already about the money and the value of advocacy. The next bullet, listen with your heart. And that is what I talked about on the previous slide of offering suggestions. And this comes from an amazing advocate in the Seattle King County area who works with immigrants and refugees. And she was just so very familiar with the fact that, sometimes people couldn't express exactly what it is that they wanted. Um, so her ability, having been in similar situations, to listen with her heart, to be very thoughtful about the judgment that often creeps in when we start thinking about giving somebody financial support. And sometimes, especially in smaller communities, when there is a history with the survivor, we can so quickly go to that place of judgment. And it's it can be challenging. And it goes back to with your heart, um, maybe not the emotional, let's just give money out everywhere, every time. I know there's that extreme, but just being discerning. Um, Consider what would happen if financial assistance isn't provided. Um, that is a question that many advocates will ask simply because they, quite frankly, don't know at times if what a survivor is asking for is something that they really would be able to do. Maybe it's one of those details that isn't implanted in their brain with their procedures and the different form problems that they might have. But ask that survivor what might happen if for some reason it can't come. And it's not a matter of the worst case scenario story gets the money, but it's just that reality and reminder in terms of doing good advocacy work, perhaps with financial folks or internal agency, about how important this money might be for somebody. And potentially, if it's something that is not allowed, and it clearly comes through that it's not allowed, there is that ability for all of us um, to advocate with funders and us together at times to advocate for policy and just what are the appeals to taxpayers and the ones who might provide so much money that we have access to, or maybe it's the private foundations. So just having that information and those stories about how important different ways of providing financial assistance make such a difference. And then also consider whether and how other resources might be leveraged. I think just about every agency will ask a survivor where else they've looked for support, what they've been able to get. And once again, my own bias here is to think about how you frame that. One of my pet peeves when I was doing shelter work um, when time began, however many years ago, and there was this expectation that a survivor in need of money just needed to go to every single church in our community and collect that $20 from each church. So looking again at the quote and thinking about how frequently that would put somebody in the position of feeling judged and feeling looked down upon, maybe not having the capacity. It's not necessarily trauma informed. So I would step back with those resources and ask simply what they've done, what has happened. Do it with them. Do they have ideas? And bring your own to the table. We all, as advocates, have a good grasp on what the resources are and the services are in our communities. So being able to do that together with them, what they might be aware of, what we could be aware of and help them with, certainly helps someone who is traumatized and not feeling safe and desperately needs to know that tomorrow will be a better day. And the thing that is preventing that sense of support and love for kids, the resiliency, can come into place soon based on what they are doing the work that you two are doing together. So forms, documenting the trip. Whenever we go on a trip, we like to have our pictures. I save scraps of things from museums and parks and the different places you stop. And so it's important to document the trip from the very beginning when we're getting ready to take it and all the places we're going to go, and then afterwards. So the questions we need to ask is, what information is necessary for our agency? This is our culture. This is the community that we serve. Um, the auditor is a part of this. What are the things that the agency absolutely needs to know based on the services that are provided? What is necessary for funders? And as you know from every grant, contract, just about everything you get, there are definitely lists of what has to happen, what they need to see, how do you document the eligibility, how do you document the different ways money is spent. Um, and this is a sideline, but I just feel a strong need to say it, that there are around the country many states where their VOCA administration is being audited, and audited very carefully. And so that's something we always have to be aware of, that it's not just our own auditors, but it is the agencies, the funding sources, our wonderful people at DSHS and OVC that are so good at getting money through to us. And at the same time, they need to make sure that they are ready for that audit, and that there isn't a federal agency or federal person that is going to say, we want you to pay this money back. So it's a partnership. Think of what they need, think of what you need. And in terms of eligibility, again, the previous webinar just goes into great detail as far as the activities. So I don't particularly want to repeat all of that. So I'm seeing Abraham asking, so going with the client when looking for other resources is always better, right? What I would say there is ask their permission. I mean, ask them if they want you to be with them. I think it can be very, very helpful. There are many who absolutely need to have that. And you figure out this, there's a whole training that goes into that side-by-side advocacy too, as far as what you're doing, how you're supporting, how you're being guided by the survivor in terms of how you identify yourself. And it might help to know that it's somebody from an agency. It might not help that individual. So certainly being aware of your resources, and maybe it is sending that client, that survivor, with your good word, if you have permission to share that, or if they feel comfortable saying, I have an advocate and they sent me your way. So again, it's survivor driven, but work with them as much as is possible, both to support them and often in the community to lend credibility. Again, I have a wonderful, wonderful advocate in a very small community who talked about accompanying and advocating alongside of survivors, and how people, of course, knew who she was. It was, it's such a small community, and would think this person is in good hands, this person needing the services, the money, the assistance, whatever is going on, they're safe and they're in good hands, and they're working on their future and their safety. So again, that whole flavor of your community and the survivor and how that is best going to work for that person. So getting back to the advocacy services, you certainly would very likely do a full-scale intake if you did that hotline screening or hotline conversation first, but certainly starting with your intakes. We do at Wiscative have a great form on our webpage um, that I can certainly try and find that link to you at some point in time, but a wonderful screening assessment and intake tool that is very respectful, very comprehensive, and being able to talk about advocacy services in a flow of a conversation. What information is helpful to guide the money disbursement? Um, so things can get complicated. I think I've already mentioned now in terms of undocumented survivors that it is not always easy to figure out a way to disperse funds either to them directly where it has the most bang for the buck in terms of their flexibility and their autonomy and confidentiality for some vendors. Um, there are certainly other things that need to be well documented in terms of the vendors, and we'll get to a little bit more of that on the next slide. But the information to get the money to where it needs to be. Forms should be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. There shouldn't be a form that is not looked at least once a year because you never know what might change. Again, funding sources might change. Your own culture might change. Now, I just have a hunch that especially after COVID-19, we are all going to be looking at communal living shelters a little bit differently. And there might be a move to see even more so what private spaces can be created. Even more so, are there alternatives? So thinking about the changes our organizations are probably going to be making, the forms that we're using to both provide services as well as to provide flexible financial assistance will also probably change with that. So some basic forms. Oh, good. Here's that screening assessment intake form. I don't think it's a live link, but at least this shows you how to get there. So I know you all have your hotline or crisis call form that you usually fill out, and this, of course, is funder driven. I remember my days over at when it used to be EDVP, where every one of our little city municipalities needed to know exactly where people were from in terms of zip codes so that they could see if this person was one of their city's residents. So whatever you need on that crisis call form, again, making it as simple as possible. The intake form, you'll certainly want to do that. It's a great source for a conversation. So please include that in your work with survivors. You may already have your own forms, or you may really have landed on this form. I think it came out about 3 or 4 years ago. It's great. Housing advocacy forms. These can be a little bit of a mixed bag. As you want to get into providing housing advocacy, and perhaps you've got some continuum of care sorts of funds, you've got funding related to housing, you get into forms that can really be invasive. And so I would, again, stop for a minute and think about some of the things that these funding sources might be asking or expecting. Some of them just really might feel that they need to have more in terms of ID when they really don't. Or they might really feel that they have to have that affirmation of citizenship, even if they really don't. So some of them will ask about HMIS. Well, you know, as victim services providers, that is something that we don't participate in. We provide demographic information to our state HMIS, and that's it. They know where people go, how many DV survivors there are coming into our programs, but in terms of tracking them, that's in direct violation of VAWA. So we don't do that. And it's just important to remember as you get into more of the housing provision and being able to pay that rental assistance and pay the things that go with housing, that where people are being housed may have some expectations that you can push back at a little bit as you are developing your forms. The financial assistance form, and here's just a basic sample on the bottom of this split screen, um, that it's basic information. Being able to know what the need is, and certainly the advocate having perhaps more of the story that goes behind that need when this is presented or submitted, um, and the amount. Now, many of you also ask about limits to amounts, and I don't know off the top of my head if VOCA, if our contracts with DSHS for these different activities have limits. I'll have to check that out. But in general, what we did with our flexible financial assistance through the Gates Foundation was we didn't have limits. And agencies were free to experiment with that, and found that it wasn't particularly useful, because as soon as they set a limit, someone would come in and need $10 over the limit. That's what happens when you get into policies. You might not have the flexibility that would be really helpful. So those financial assistance forms that are simple, that are developed with the funders in mind, how you're getting the money, how you need to get it out there. The release of information, ROI, which is specific for a vendor. And this is really something important that you need to have unless you are able to provide money directly to a survivor. I know most of us can't. So when you're thinking about a vendor, you need to think about how should you be identified? Is it okay for this individual to know that this person is seeking services from a domestic violence agency? Are there other ways to do that? Again, one of my back in the day memories is being at LifeWire, what used to be EDVP, and having a separate account, not with the agency name on it, but it was a board member's name, trust account, and that's what checks were made out to the vendor, to the person who was providing the facility or the place that somebody lived, and we needed to pay rent. So it was a way of protecting that confidentiality and that information. If you're going to talk directly to the vendor or provide money to the vendor in a way that it's really clear what you are and who you are, you need that ROI from the survivor you're working with, and the conversation that goes with that. W-9 forms for vendors. We all know that we need W-9s from the people that we contract with, and this is no different. Just a little addition again here, a challenge. There are a number of mom and pop landlords, small landlords, often culturally specific community landlords, rural landlords, who don't want to fill out the W-9. And the reasons I won't go into, but it's, they just won't. But they would be willing to rent to that undocumented survivor. So it's trying to figure out then a workaround. If we can't give the survivor money directly, is there something else that we could pay for that would fall under the eligibility on a regular basis, at least for a few months, that would enable that survivor to pay the vendor directly with what they might have? And the agency could pay for something else in a different way. So just keeping in mind the importance there. When you're looking at the housing homeless world and assorted requirements that come with pretty much anything that comes through HUD, including COCs, is you need that income verification. And you also need that self-certification of homelessness. Um, I emphasize self-certification. I think the regulation actually lists this at the bottom of all sorts of other places and people. We like to keep it simple, and we appreciate the fact that HUD has recognized our issues as far as domestic violence service providers, that this can and should be self-certified, and that we need to believe survivors, including their situation of homelessness. It's not as though they're going to be racing into one of our facilities or into housing that we have if they don't desperately need it. Are there any thoughts about asking for picture ID? Thank you. Well, I would go to, what is it that you need it for? I will say that in a stretch of my work life, I was a monitor. I was on the funder side for a while. And I remember actually monitoring some files where a copy of somebody's picture ID was in the file. And so you look at all of our concerns about what are in files, subpoenas, where they might possibly go, and just the idea of what do you need that for? What is the purpose of that picture ID? Is it something that you just want to look at? And again, I would ask why. So I would say why, and say that again, in my own history of being a service provider, as well as when I was on the contract monitor side, I really told people I don't want to see IDs. Yeah, and I, just to say one more thing about ID, as well as any number of other things that we might inquire about, because we have on one side of us, we are stewards of money. We are stewards of whether it's taxpayer money, foundation money. We're stewards of that money, and we want to make sure every single advocate, every single agency, that it is used well. There's always the concern that people might not always be honest and forthcoming. And again, when you put on your trauma-informed lens, you know that there are many reasons for that survival mode, that many reasons for the desperation of, I need to get this and I need to figure out and get it no matter how. So we certainly have that hat on to make sure that every bit that we spend is spent appropriately for the people who need it the most. On the other side, it is considering whom we work with. And folks, as that earlier quote said, I feel judged. I hate to ask. It's embarrassing. And when we're checking up on them in their story, or the feeling that we don't trust them, which isn't necessarily picture ID, it might be other sorts of documentation. I've just seen a ton of documents that people feel that they need to gather. But just the implication that we need to make sure that you are getting this money, that we are fulfilling all of our funder compliance expectations. And I do see people in the chat box. So if your agency helps with people's cars, gas, you probably need proof that that individual can legally drive, which would mean a driver's license, at least as far as grantors are concerned. So Stephanie, you've definitely got a point in terms of, are we giving money to people who don't have licenses? Are we giving money to people, and so is it our liability somehow if something happens to them? And I don't know if grantors, and maybe this is something, I think I've got Meta, Maureen, I think I've got some folks here that could tell me if you require somehow to have a driver's license in order for an agency to fix somebody's car or pay for gas? And I'll just say a few more things and wait to see if there's a response. Um, we can also assume that somebody is going to be doing the driving. Um, I also know that we can and need to be aware that this might be for somebody else. This might be for the neighbor, the brother, the sister. There are a fair number of people that I know that can't legally drive, but they are able to get people to drive for them, with them, even as there are people who don't have driver's licenses. So again, I'm not sure that we need proof for that. I would be curious if one of our funders could step up with that. Listening to a fair number of survivors, especially in rural communities, well, not even just rural, this can be an issue. I remember some of the things that agencies would pay for with flexible financial assistance were things like driver's lessons. It's not as though it's easy to go through the lesson process, to the cost for the ID. You could always ask, if you don't have a license, is it cost related? Could we help you with that? So, okay, so there's Meta. This may vary by funder. It is important to be able to document that public funds were used for an allowable purpose. I'm not sure picture ID or license verification is the only way to document that. So I would imagine the allowable purpose is car repair in an emergency, or gas. That's part of transportation. And before you provide that, do you need to see somebody's driver's license? I don't know of a grantor off the top of my head that requires that, but then I don't know everything. So sorry about the long, lengthy, thoughtful answer, but I tend to do that. I hope you don't mind that with questions in terms of going back and forth and weighing pros and cons. And this is part of the reason why there is nothing really arbitrary about some of our procedures and what are the things we're expecting to get from people. So moving on, and this is the review, the wrap up. Oh, do I see? What's a new share? Nope, that's not going to do it. Never mind. So who makes the decisions? Are advocates empowered? Starting right there at the top, the review, and you can think a few minutes about what that looks like in your agency. How about the education for advocates? What does their map look like? Another thing to reflect on. How often are forms and processes reviewed and updated? How could the process be more survivor-centered? Can support be offered even when there isn't a specific ask from survivors? And what documentation is actually necessary? So the questions that you can ask yourself, please feel free to reach out to your funders. I know they are always open for questions and concerns, happy to do some of that problem solving, and with the VOCA money, most certainly pulling out the VOCA rule from on high and just going through what's eligible, what isn't, and where is there wiggle room. Right, Meta continues, best advice is for the program to check directly with their contract manager because it can vary by funder and programs may need to check with each funder. So if there is question, again, be willing to reach out, eager to reach out. And I will say that I have never known a funder who didn't care very, very deeply about the people we serve, about survivors, um, and being able to be in partnership is pretty important. And my experience has been, and especially with VOCA money, and I've watched VOCA administrators around the country, including here in Washington State with our wonderful Meta, um, who care very deeply and want to do it right so that there are never any problems with the funding or with their programs, and absolutely are survivor driven. So it's important to have that open communication, to check if you're not sure, if you think it could be an issue. Can we provide money without any other services? That is dependent upon, again, the funder. I think there is always that encouragement from funder as well as desire from the agency um, to provide services, to make that available. You know, on the other side, we also know, and this is especially when you're doing the housing sorts of activities, we know that providing support and services shouldn't be contingent, um, or receiving services shouldn't be contingent upon requirements. So there's a little bit of a tension there. You know, on the flip side, and this is something as a service provider I would certainly advocate for, and that's the importance of being supportive and reaching out and really making clear that we're there, but also being open to the fact that maybe a survivor isn't interested in other services that we have. So there's that tension of how much, not enough, a little. And there are some programs, and both in Washington, D.C., and we've got some locally, that really don't necessarily do services along with their flexible financial assistance. And I don't know if that includes the VOCA money. I've noticed in what I've read with the VOCA aspects, and this is many pages, so I don't remember it all, but I certainly see the encouragement or the expectation that services would be coming with money. I'll move on to Abraham again. I have a concern. How can we as advocates be better about making sure our limited funds are going to people who are deserving without being investigators and crossing boundaries? And I think, again, that weighing back and forth of who we are, we really want to make sure the money goes to benefit the people who really need it and who need it the most. And my earlier encouragement, when you connect with people, when you're talking with people, being aware of trauma impacts that that person is coming with. And those can be wide and varied in terms of the survival mechanisms that people will use in order to get what it is they need. And you're going to make mistakes. You talk about being investigators, and I know that is, you know, that's a challenge. We don't want to do that. We don't want to make assumptions about people and their past, because it is hurtful. We certainly know that. And yet, we will make mistakes. We will trust, and we will be hurt and burnt. And, you know, that then there's that awkwardness of, okay, we really got burnt with this one. So what does that mean? Do we need to tighten up how we provide services and money, especially money? And one of the advantages of working with DV Housing First and our pilot programs was the encouragement from the Gates Foundation to make mistakes, to take risks, you know, just not worry about it. They weren't going to be tracking where money was going. They were the direct contractor. And it opened up the ability for different programs and staff from different programs to share some of the ways they really got burned. And there were some horror stories. And even with the ways they got burned, I do have distinct stories, and I won't share them because that might be disclosing too much about an agency, but really distinct stories about how the advocate just kind of said, well, that money sure didn't help where it was supposed to. Um, that that money or those new tires got sold, and now they're off using. They used it for drugs or alcohol. So, you know, things like that happen. And so it was a matter in cases similar to that where the advocate was able to go back um, without judgment so much as what happened? How are you? Um, how can I help you? That really didn't work for what the money was for and what you said you needed it. So it can often, when you make a mistake or not even make a mistake, you trust, and that person um, somehow violates that trust. So how can you go back in and address that and offer support? Maybe not money anytime soon, but offer support. So probably a long answer to your question. And again, I see the limited funds, and it is so easy for us to go into that scarcity mode so that we're often rationing money out or get really upset when somebody, just is not really trustworthy. So we've gone through our little review circle, and we are ready to just really wrap up our travel, our journeys. I do want to say that we are available to answer questions. There we go. So going to our webpage and the DV Housing First page, and here is the Welcome to the Housing First Toolkit. And there is a whole segment here on flexible financial assistance. We'll be updating this soon. We've got another great report out of 3 years worth of flexible financial assistance that was distributed to our 8 research site, demonstration site organizations, what happened with it. There's focus group information here, as well as great numbers. It was fascinating for me, and I know this is an eligible VOCA expense, but the greatest percentage, average percentage of how the money was used for housing impact was to help people stay safely in their own home. So keeping that in mind is, just another thought in terms of how you're helping people. But please feel free to access that. And I think I can figure out a way to end the meeting. I'm ending the meeting. Goodbye, everybody. This has been great. Stay safe, stay healthy, and enjoy the rest of your day.